Okay, I think it's probably a good idea to get started. So hello, good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to what is the third webinar in our three-part series focusing on alternative proteins, which we at Table are organising in collaboration with the United Nations Foundation and the UK's Food Standards Agency. As a reminder, for those who haven't joined before, I'm the director of Table. We're an outfit that works with food system stakeholders to explore the future of food, and we look at the ways in which scientific evidence and social values inform often conflicting visions and arguments for necessary change. So really we try and look at the enmeshment between evidence and values that inform food systems discussion, trying to get to grips with how and why people disagree and where there might be points of commonality and agreement. So that brings me to the topic of this event, alternative proteins. All of you, some of you are familiar faces at the previous webinars, and you will know that this is a category of very diverse category of foods, from lentils through to veggie burgers, through to the noveler end of the alternative protein spectrum. And the focus of this series has been on that end, so particularly on cell-cultivated meat and precision fermentation derived products, because these are the ones that attract the most debate. So we are not going to be paying a lot of attention to less processed forms such as lentils and beans, because generally speaking, everyone agrees these are a good thing, and the real challenge is how to increase, get people to eat more of them. Anyway, so this is the third in the series. So the first webinar looked at investment trends in the regulatory environment. The second looked at debates around their health dimensions, and both are available to watch again. And Jackie will be, our comms manager will be probably posting in the chat. So in this third and final webinar, we'll be focusing on environmental issues and questions. And I'm delighted to be joined by four great panelists. So Hanna Tuomisto, who's a professor of sustainable food systems at the University of Helsinki and Natural Resources Institute in Finland. Joel Scott Hawkes, who's the campaigns director at We Planet. Phil Howard, who's professor in the Department of Community Sustainability at Michigan State University, and my colleague, Jen Dodsworth, who is a research fellow working on environmental policy and sustainable land governance, and who is also a hill farmer. So their bios are all in the chat. And I should also just give a shout out to Josh, who's in the background, Joshua Rees, who has been organising this series and will be writing a discussion paper, which hopefully draws some of the threads together. So when it comes to the environmental implications of these foods, from initial chats with panelists in advance of this event, in preparation, the conversation is very likely to explore differing perspectives on what metrics we should and should not be using to assess the impact of these foods, as well as different attitudes to technology, and in particular to different kinds of problem framings. So differences in how we think about what our core problems are, and therefore what solutions we might seem to be as legitimate and effective, as well as different ideas about what ought to happen and what good looks like for the food system. So we're going to start with very short presentations from each of the four panelists, and then have a panel discussion ending up with leaving about 30 minutes for Q&A. And if you have a question, please post it in the Q&A session of the chat, of the, not the chat side of it. So that's it from me for now, and I'm going to hand over to Hanna, who will share her screen.
Okay, thank you. So I will share my screen. You should see it now. Okay. Yes, so I'm Hanna Tuomisto. I'm a professor of sustainable food systems at the University of Helsinki and Natural Resources Institute Finland, LUKE. And today I talk about what do we know about environmental sustainability of alternative proteins. And you all are probably familiar with the alternative proteins and what they include, but actually I want to explain a little bit about the terminology that I use for the cellular agriculture. So with cellular agriculture, I mean the technologies that use cell culturing for producing agricultural products, and that includes cellular products that consist of the cells that have been cultivated, for instance, cultivated meat, but also non-food products like leather, fur, wood, and offal, for example, for pet food, also for food, of course, as well, can be produced with these technologies. Also, microbial proteins, where the whole cells, the whole microbe is eaten, is included in the cellular products. And then the acellular products are substances that are produced by the cells, also called precision fermentation, where the cells, microbial cells, are genetically modified to produce some substances, for instance, proteins like milk proteins, caseins, or whey protein, ovalbumin, egg white protein. Also fatty acids like omega-3 fatty acids can be produced with these technologies. And then also these products can be grouped based on the carbon source. So if they use carbohydrates as carbon source, or if they are gas fermented microbes, that they can use carbon dioxide or methane as carbon source. And so there have been a lot of life cycle assessment studies estimating the environmental impacts of alternative proteins. And what these studies generally show is that the land use of the alternative proteins is relatively low, but then energy use, especially for some of these cell-cultivated foods, can be quite high. And here we talk about industrial electricity or energy like electricity, not including the feed energy. So animals get the energy from the feed, whereas then in cellular agriculture, we have to replace that energy partly with electricity. And then the carbon footprint depends on the source of energy, the electricity source, especially for these cell-cultivated foods. But these studies still show that the carbon footprint is lower than compared to beef, even when the standard electricity mix has been used. But then it can be even lower when renewable or low emission electricity sources have been used. But then we need to move beyond this type of product level life cycle assessments and also consider other factors like food production and consumption. So also like how many people are willing to start to consume these foods, what kind of nutritional content these foods have, and how they can be incorporated in sustainable diets. We need to also consider the other commodities that the livestock produces many non-food products as well. So then if we replace livestock products with alternative proteins, we need to think about how we produce these other byproducts and what the environmental impacts of that would be. And then we need to also consider the other land uses. So if we need less land for food production, then how we will use the land that is possibly released from agriculture and what kind of impacts that would have. And then energy production, will we have enough renewable electricity capacity in the world also if the electricity consumption increases in food sector as well. And yeah, environmental changes, how these are going to affect everything and how these alternative proteins could improve our resilience to environmental changes as well. So thank you. I will leave it here.
Thanks, Hannah. Thanks very much. We're now going to move on to Joel. So if you could share your screen, Joel.
Excellent. Can everyone tell me, is that working?
Yep.
Excellent. Last time Tara kindly invited me to speak, we had 1 minute for each presentation. So this feels positively novelistic. So thank you, Tara. This is great. I'll start my timer now. As a campaigner, obviously we're always looking for sort of interventions, things that we campaign against. And I'm particularly interested in finding things that we can campaign for, not just against, which is partly what's brought me here. Now, I was very lucky to grow up for the best period of my childhood in the beautiful temperate rainforest river valley in Cornwall that you can see before you. And as all hobbits that grow up in a shire have the experience of, as I headed out into the bigger, wider world, I was generally disappointed by what I found, particularly just how sort of devoid of life and ecologically depleted most of the rest of the country feels, and particularly farmland when you walk across your average farmed field. Now, I'd later discovered, interestingly, that the reason that the valley I grew up in was wooded was because of its steepness. It was simply too steep to cultivate. It had been spared by agriculture. And interestingly, that would be corroborated later on as I started as an environmental campaigner to try and understand that big question. If food really is the biggest driver of the 6th mass extinction, which pretty much everyone's agreed on, then what is it about food that makes it such an appalling assault on wildlife? Now, there's many different ways of telling that story, but this is perhaps the most significant bit of data I've found. This is Royal Society visualization of IUCN data. And along the bottom axis, you can see there threats to wildlife, threats to species from different aspects of agriculture. And up the y-axis, that's the number of species threatened by it. Now, obviously, and I'm sure this would happen to you, feel bombarded and emotionally motivated by the talk of chemicals, pollution, herbicides, pesticides. That must be the bad thing. Organic agriculture must be the solution. But this data is pretty revealing, and putting that in context, agricultural pollution here is dwarfed by agricultural land use change. And that simple finding is backed up by recent research by considering a very substantial review by Andrew Bamford at Cambridge, which concluded that if you can spare land for nature, that in broadest global terms is what does nature best. Now, this land use is not a small localized issue to the valleys of Cornwall. It's of course a major global issue. And this spatialized graphic here from Our World in Data really puts a stark picture on what we're facing. And that is that today, livestock, its production and its feed crops that go into it take up astonishingly more land mass than all of the world's forests surviving, 27 by 26%. And that is a figure that mostly has happened just in the last century, 40% of it, and a figure that could potentially grow as the world's meat consumption continues to increase. Now, viewed in that context, as a campaigner, my feeling is that we need every single string to our bow to tackle this very complex system, but certainly a system that's got one simple kind of health problem to it, which is its land use. So I bring here one example of alternative proteins that we find particularly fascinating. This is Solein from Solar Foods in Finland, not far from Hannah. And this is using a hydrogen metabolizing microorganism to produce a perfect protein with all the amino acids needed. Now, we did some research about this just as a test case for, theoretically speaking, how could this help with the land use issue? And we came up with a couple of headline grabbing figures, which is that biomass fermentation, this is technically what that's called because you eat the organism itself as the protein, can be up to, if you power it with wind power rather than say coal or some worse power for the electricity source, 40,900 times more land efficient calorie for calorie than beef. That's essentially a way of saying if you use renewable energy for this, it's essentially a land-free form of agriculture. Now, whether that would be desirable for anywhere other than, say, living on the moon to just get your food from this, it's undeniable that putting this into the mix of a very complex food system is going to relieve pressure at a global scale. One might run the thought experiment of just precision fermenting and cultivating just pet food, which accounts for 20% roughly of global meat production and consumption. But even if we were to discount land as an issue, I would argue that we need to bear in mind this figure, which is the 75 billion land animals that our food system requires to slaughter every single year for food. This webinar is importantly titled as an environmental topic, but curiously, when we draw our line around what we consider the environment, we tend to draw it around all the sentient beings in wild habitats and care very much about the leopards and the cheetahs and the beavers, and forget to extend the line around the sentient animals in our food system who do deserve concern as well. And notably, it's always a bit emotively and manipulative when people do this, but to put that figure in context, during the time of this webinar, if animals were being slaughtered at a standard rate, we'd get through just under 13 million of them just the time we've been sitting here talking. Now, for me, I see alternative proteins potentially, if managed democratically with all the checks and balances and as part of a systemic approach, which sees a proper political economy critique of power of who owns these proteins, lots of caveats there, but potentially as part of a broader societal shift away from the exploitation of animals towards synthetic sources of production, be it from the pig pancreases we used to mash up for insulin, the horses we use from everything from warfare to mining, to even the animals we used to have on screen that we've now replaced with CGI. And what I worry about is that if there is not some semi-enthusiastic, at least, backing from the environmental community for investment in these, that we might end up with an unholy alliance at both ends of the horseshoe, the left and right coming together in a strange technophobia that's holding back potentially one of our most powerful tools to change this. That is, well-meaning people with a good critique of the food system on the left, who have an innate technophobia, strangely finding themselves in the same position as big meat-backed right-wing politicians such as Ron DeSantis here banning cultivated meat. What we need, for my final slide, is a sensible but pretty radical centre ground, which is to see alternative proteins as part of a mix, potentially something that could alleviate pressure to bias the space, quite literally, but also the metaphorical breathing space for other land uses like high yield agroecology, rewilding, or something in between for low yield livestock systems that could be somewhere into agri rewilding and also for cultural historic benefits. That's a world I would like to see in which alternative proteins could play a part if we don't block them. Thanks.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Joel. I'm now going to move on to Phil. Phil, can you share your screen? Great. You're on mute, though.
My unmute button moves, so you can hear me now?
Yep.
Okay, yeah. Yeah, I find discussions around alternative protein to be very reductionist. So for example, livestock have many functions, not just for food, but traction, fertilizer, wool, leather, and so on. But it's become reductionist to refer to livestock as simply meat. And more recently, there's this trend of referring to animal source foods as simply protein, even though meat and dairy and eggs actually contain many nutrients. And it's to the point where not just industry people, but an increasing number of scientists and sustainability advocates will refer to chickens and cattle as simply protein. And what's really strange about this is most people in the world already consume adequate or too much protein. So here are some maps that show the darkest shade of blue represents 3 times as much as needed. So at the top left, that's the situation for carbohydrates from much of the world. At the middle right, you see red represents less than the needed. So for vitamin D, most of the world is getting inadequate amounts of this nutrient. So if you look at protein, just to the right of carbohydrates, you can see that the areas that are lacking, that are inadequate for protein are also inadequate for all of these other nutrients. So in other words, they're lacking in food, not just protein. And 50 years ago, McLaren and the Lancet pointed out that this development efforts and food aid efforts that overemphasize protein, that was wrong. But 50 years later, we're doing the same thing. And if you look zoomed in at protein a little more, excessive amounts, more than twice as much as needed, are being consumed in the US, parts of Europe, North Africa, and South America. So the world is actually awash in food. We don't need more protein. We don't even need more food. The question we're not asking is why are we producing too much food, and why isn't it going where it needs to? So who's benefiting from this? Well, the largest meat processors in the world are using this umbrella of protein to expand into other industries. Tyson actually trademarked the term the protein company. Other firms that describes themselves as protein companies are Cargill, Maple Leaf Foods. And so they find it very useful. And we see companies like JBS, for example, spending hundreds of millions of dollars to acquire salmon aquaculture firms, plant-based meat substitutes, as well as lab-grown or cellular meat firms. And it's not just JBS. All of the world's largest meat processors and fish processors are investing in these startups. And they're very clear on they don't want others to disrupt us. That's the strategy behind investing in these firms. So companies like JBS are heavily promoting more consumption of their plant-based meat substitutes on one hand, and on the other hand, they're promoting continued increased consumption of their industrial meat products. So this leads to the displacement paradox. Richard York and his colleagues have described how something that could be potentially an alternative, a substitute for a product, may not actually decrease demand for that product. Instead, is simply added on. And this is very common in a political economic context where everything is encouraging people to eat more and more and more, or consume more and more and more. So this shows over the last few decades rapidly increasing consumption of fish and pork, and especially poultry, but this has not decreased demand for meat, for beef and other meat. So just to recap, key points here are there's a misplaced emphasis on a macronutrient that most people consume in excessive amounts. Alternative higher protein startups are being monopolized by dominant meat and seafood processors, and they have no incentive to undermine their current revenue streams. And this may lead to alternative higher protein foods simply being added on rather than substituting for industrial animal agriculture products. Thanks.
Thank you, Phil. So I'm now going to pass on to Jen, who I don't think has a presentation, but who can perhaps reflect on what she's heard so far from your multiple different perspectives.
Thanks so much, Tara. I do have some pretty pictures, which I'll quickly share. But thank you so much. And yeah, I think I have already learned a lot from the three of you presenting. And just for the audience's sake, I am not an alternative proteins expert by any means. I work much more, as Tara said, on the agri-environment schemes and working with farmers, working on moving towards more environmentally friendly, sustainable modes of farming, specifically in the UK context. And I happen to be a farmer. Here are some pictures from my upland farm in the North Pennines in Cumbria. We start at around 1400 foot and only go up. So it's exactly the sort of farm that I'm pretty sure a lot of folks would say shouldn't really be a farm at all, should just be sort of given back to nature. I hope some of what I'll say today will sort of show that I actually broadly agree with a lot of Joel's statements, which people might find surprising. But I actually see my farm as somewhere that can really deliver a lot of these kind of environmental benefits, and I'm really keen to pursue that. And I see my farm as fitting in this every string to our bow approach that Joel mentioned, that I think is really compelling. It's sort of an everything everywhere all at once, maybe apart from the very intensive agribusiness that we see as providing well, no environmental benefits, and also providing a lot of the issues that Joel mentioned with regards to animal welfare, and eating a lot of the sort of human available proteins and other sources of fiber, that if wholesale business, larger business allowed, could go into the human chain but end up in the animal supply chain. I'm thinking a lot of kind of, you know, wheat and barley crops here, that if it weren't for kind of very strict requirements from millers, might actually be just fine to go into our everyday breads and other products. So that reconfiguration of the food system is something I do broadly agree with. I was really interested in Hannah's presentation, and I was surprised that, you know, cell products can include, you know, all these other elements: leather, fur, wood. And it did make me wonder about Phil's comment regarding the sort of, we don't need any more protein, but it does seem that a lot of countries, Phil, on the maps that you showed us, we're still devoid in quite a lot of nutrients. And I wonder if the cultured meats do provide the same nutrients, in which case, is there actually a strong case for these alternative proteins, these cultured meats, providing some of those nutrients, the zinc, etc., that maybe we're lacking in our diet? So I found it really fascinating to hear this. And yeah, I agree with Phil's point regarding a very reductionist view of livestock as simply protein. And from my farmer's perspective, alongside elements like taste, texture, and provenance of particular breeds, for instance, I also have a really strong sense of affinity to the animals themselves, which I imagine a lot of vegans who have a very strong ethical rejection of the livestock industry would think that, you know, as a farmer who in the end does send these animals to kill, I don't care about their life, but their life is the most important thing to me. And I think that there's a lot of really interesting questions around kind of the culture of farming and the culture of agriculture that we haven't explored yet, and how that will be impacted by these changes in land use, which are certainly needed, is still something that's worthy of consideration. Just to briefly show, I've only got a minute left, Tara, but the land use consultation in England, I happen to have this slide prepared, Tara, is the land use consultation happened earlier this year in England. And as you can see from the two modelled scenarios on the left, where I live in the North Pennines is that deep purple part in the very top of the north. Most models show that where I live is the area that should receive the most land use change, that should essentially be given over to nature, as the sort of Bamford Bateman paper that Joel referenced has referenced will need to happen to some of our land. Interesting, one thing from that paper I noted was that actually the UK was the one place where land sharing was a really compelling approach, where I know as they modelled a lot of the other countries, land sparing in certain instances was most useful. For the UK specific cases they looked at, land sharing, especially for, you know, our breeding waders, was seen as actually really beneficial. But these models show that somewhere like where I live is being determined almost automatically as in need of significant change. A lot's being said about farmers, but not much is being said to farmers, and not much is being said with us about these futures. And that's something I'd be really keen to explore further today.
Well, thank you all. That was a really fascinating set of presentations, and in fact, Jen, you've done quite a lot of work of trying to kind of draw together and reflect upon what you've heard. So I am kind of redundant, but one thing I did want to highlight was that Phil, I was very struck with your comment about the displacement paradox, and we do see that, and it is something that, you know, is a phenomenon. You know, as you see in the shops, anyone who goes to their local supermarket in the UK, at least, you see more and more of these alternative proteins, but you don't see, the stats aren't really showing a particularly significant, and indeed even that the decline that some have questioned whether there is a genuine decline in consumption of animal products here in the UK. However, one conclusion that could be drawn from that, Phil, is that technology may not be sufficient, but it could nevertheless be necessary. In other words, that you seem to have, maybe I'm oversimplifying things here, but you see a kind of a divide or a dichotomy between technological solutions on the one hand, and the policy changes that are needed to move us away from excessive consumption of foods of all kinds. Could they not go hand in hand together? Do you feel that because JBS and all the other sort of the big boys in the big food family, because they are investing in these proteins, does that not perhaps argue the case for strong regulation while also giving a sort of cautious green light to that as part of a kind of suite of different approaches to address our problems? That's a very long question, but how do you see all that?
Yeah, the problem I see is, there's really no issue with plant-based meat substitutes that are produced by, these smaller firms that don't have patent protections or trade secrets preventing everyone else from producing them. And if it's encouraging people to theoretically steer away from eating less meat, but it actually reinforces these center of the plate dietary patterns, this tradition of having a large piece of meat or a meat substitute in the center of the plate with a small amount of other foods around it. And that's getting pushed into other cultures instead of eating more like the traditional Mediterranean diet, which hundreds of epidemiological studies show is a good diet both for health and ecologically, where meat or even plant beans and lentils and so on are a smaller part of the plate. There's more fruit and vegetable consumption. So in China, for example, there's been a massive increase in dairy consumption, and it looks like it's driving down consumption of fruits and vegetables as a result. So this focus on protein is misplaced, and there should be a more systemic perspective of first getting food to people who don't have enough food, and then trusting that they will, using their local cultures, make the right decisions about nutrition. And then on the other hand, to dismantle the subsidies that these big firms are receiving to continue to push their industrial products like dairy in China, or industrial meat products in the U.S., chicken, eat more chicken. That shouldn't be tax-free to be able to, a tax deduction to market those types of products.
Okay, thanks. Hannah, you've got a question, or you've got a comment, or I don't know if it's a response, or
yeah, exactly. I wanted to comment on this. Yeah, I agree with the fact that I think we have too much emphasis on the meat alternatives now, like trying to replace meat with something plant-based or alternative proteins, because then, of course, it might be tastier food to make just something out of beans or peas, like some kind of Asian food, or many cultures have excellent tasting food that is just not trying to mimic meat. So yeah, we should also try to teach people to cook food, vegetarian food from plant legumes. But then on the other hand, I see that I don't think it's that big problem that the meat companies are in the field of alternative proteins and plant-based foods, because what I have seen in Finland is that there have been some smaller startups that have created new plant-based meat replacements or meat substitutes. And then some bigger, for example, a dairy company in Finland acquired this kind of startup, and they started to produce because they know how to produce in high volumes. And we have many other examples of that as well, that actually these kind of existing bigger companies, they are able to produce cheaper plant-based foods. And there is markets for these meat substitutes as well, because for many people, when they switch to plant-based diets or flexitarian diets, it's much easier to replace the meat with something plant-based which mimics meat, so they know how to cook it, so they can make similar dishes that they have used to eating before, but they just use this meat substitute. So yeah, I don't see that as this big problem that Phil says. Thanks.
Thank you, Joel.
Yeah, well, I was going to talk about something else, but actually to follow on for that, I mean, you kind of theoretically, if a large portion of JBS's revenue was coming from cultivated meat, instead of it just being an additional market, which I think Phil's completely right to warn us about, that could be the potential. But these companies start to look a bit less evil, right? If they're not chopping down vast swathes of the rainforest for the product. And it's interesting at the moment, given where we are happy to live with large concentration in markets, it's not an ideal situation, but certainly everyone's happily racing towards net zero with 80 to 90% of solar PV production in a single country in China. So there's something here about recognizing the urgency of an environmental crisis that could be existential, sometimes comes with some trade-offs in the short term that need to be dealt with at the same time, but it's not a slam on the brakes. It's right, we're going to have to deal with this and ramp up our own domestic production, say in the solar PV case. I thought I just respond because I in some agreement with Phil about the kind of the centrality of the plate issue. For me, a lot of the interesting stuff is happening on the almost hidden from the plate, actually, which there is a huge amount of hidden dairy in particular in people's diets through processed foods, be it from your biscuits to your ready meal lasagna, huge amounts of hidden meat as well with an increasingly processed food dominated market. And then I come back to the pet food issue. That's 1/5 of certainly Western meat production. And so in there, you've got this curious thing of there might not require a huge amount of kind of conscious choice or change amongst the consumer for an impact to start. And I've certainly seen some models suggest that without increased subsidies, the carcass balance already is so borderline profitable for the livestock industry, and certainly is the case in the UK, that even a small 5-10% dent could really start to shift some sort of, well, it's been described by some of the sort of death spiral where rising costs will be needed to compensate for that, which in turn drives consumers away as the steak, say, gets more and more expensive. But I would say, obviously, that the aspiration here for using alternative proteins, it's not the silver bullet, just technology will just fix it, let them get onto it, because it does fill me with absolute horror, the thought of major concentration, and what if Musk ends up owning 20% of global protein supply? It's not actually that implausible when you think about it within 20 years, and that really is terrifying. But with Bourguibian taxes and subsidies, you can be very strategic about this. And the UK having a land use framework and actually thinking about this as more holistically, you really could see this as just a helpful lever to start kind of actually have some latency in the system.
Yeah, Jen, and I've got a question as well that I'd like to bring in, but Jen, you've got a question you wanted to note. You're on mute.
Sorry. Yeah, I guess less a question, more just well, yeah, it is a question, I guess, to Phil and to Joel to some extent about kind of environmental justice in this case, also having really important social justice dimensions. Joel, you mentioned that some of these big companies who Hannah mentioned, it might not be a problem if they're kind of the big meat agribusiness industry is also a part of these companies, if they are less evil, if they're chopping down less rainforest. But Phil's evidence to me seemed to suggest they're kind of not chopping down less rainforest, they're just getting rich through another means as well as this one. And you mentioned this sort of sense of urgency, and the sense of urgency which we absolutely have in the sort of biodiversity and climate crisis, but has in some very real instances, including in the UK, led to the kind of overriding of local communities, particularly tenant communities of land managers, and a sort of disregard in some cases of their, not just their way of life, but actually the knowledge that they have of this land and where they might play a really valuable role in improving these landscapes. So I guess I want to know how you guys both see the kind of reconciling of these alternative proteins not being this silver bullet, but also with this urgency, how do we ensure that these social dimensions, the social justice, is carried through with the environmental justice that we hope alternative proteins can contribute towards?
After you, Phil.
Yeah, I think the challenge is this seems like a very alluring strategy because it seems feasible. And the political economic changes that are required seem insurmountable, particularly right now and in the United States. But that's what is needed to A, get food to where it is needed rather than producing more food that's going to go to waste. B, to actually protect land. There's no guarantee if you assume you're going to produce food purely in a factory rather than at landscape scales that that land will actually protect it and will be rewilded. In the US, there's massive development of lands that could be used for agriculture or not being used for agriculture. They're being paved and so on. So there are a lot of assumptions here that I think need to be questioned. And unfortunately, it feels like a distraction to go down this path of hoping that billionaires will fund startups that will produce a product that people will just switch over and solve all these problems. It leaves many, many other problems unaddressed, even if that did occur.
Can I just come in looking at this question from two angles? Because I think, you know, what I'm hearing is that one is that we're in a hurry, we've got to address our problems. This is something that we can do. It could spare land and do all the other things that Joel's talking about. And then the point that it is undemocratic, uninclusive, and actually might be a sticking plaster job when the real problems are corporate control of the food system. However, Joel has also brought in the little matter of 70 billion animals slaughtered a year. And I think that is interesting to reflect upon. And from a different perspective, Hannah's point about the energy mix and about renewables and about the inevitability of some kind of governance framework that will prioritize across uses when it comes to energy use and the extent to which these products will get a kind of a slice of the energy pie there. And so I guess that they're the kind of two pincer issues that do they, you know, so I guess one question is, will these proteins be able to take off if they aren't able to do so in a way that meets any kind of net zero obligations because of their energy hungriness? And the second is, you know, while we're waiting for a transformation of the food system, a lot of animals are dying in a way that causes a lot of suffering, and you don't have to be a vegan to care about that, as I think everyone around this Zoom does. So I don't know, any thoughts there on either of those two issues? Hannah?
Yeah, I would like to comment on the energy issue, because there is also another aspect than just asking if we can produce enough renewable energy, because there is also the resilience issue and the electricity cuts that we have been seeing recently. So then, like, if we have a food production system that is really relying on stable electricity supply, then it can be really risky. Whereas like if we have an electricity cut, the plants will grow and the animals, grazing animals, will eat the grass. So there is also this side that we should consider.
Yeah, I've heard the reverse as well, that some alternative proteins can boost resilience because they provide another form of food production to bolster in case of crop failures in some shape or form.
Yeah, exactly. So then, yeah, maybe it's a mixture of different technologies, but we should not rely only on these kind of technologies that are heavily dependent on electricity.
Yeah, and on the animal welfare piece, obviously that's something self-explanatory from my slides that concerns me greatly. And I mean, might be an opportunity to paint a kind of alternative picture to sort of turbo capitalism leading this transformation. There is a world in which a progressive government that perhaps, even headed by some animal welfare concerned individuals might say, look, this actually is a big strategic priority for us as a society. We really shouldn't be slaughtering all these animals and using all this land. We could rewild it. And holistically, that could look like all the other things we've talked about, agri-environment schemes to make sure land actually gets rewilded and not used by other purposes. That is possible. We've done it in Costa Rica, brilliant example, right? That's not beyond the wit of humans to work out. But then in terms of the safeguards to avoid corporate concentration, limiting patents, it's not out of the question. It's not that dramatic and extreme an idea. But even thinking about whether there is a way of sort of localizing ownership of these firms so they don't end up in the hands of big global multinationals. It's a bit whimsical, but of course in this country we've got the idea of the council farm, which is literally a local government owned piece of food production that was generally for the training of young apprentice farmers and such like. And I think there's actually something in that could be explored here. The dark side of that is a sort of Solent green dystopia where the state controls all protein production. That doesn't sound very nice either. But there are cracks of light here for a food system that does incorporate this with some sense of strategic purpose to it, not just the slightly benevolent hand of the market here.
So I think those points are interesting. So one of the things that also leads on to your point, Jen, that you made about like farmers being talked at and told to, and not ever being listened with, and but I think you have come back from groundswell for non-UK listeners. This is an annual, getting bigger and bigger get together of farmers who are broadly aligned with ideas about regenerative agriculture. And I think there were some sessions there on alternative proteins where the discussions were quite thoughtful and not very polarized. Is that about right?
I didn't make it to the alternative protein.
Right.
At that stage, I was going to be on this panel.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. No, I mean, groundswell is always certainly a very farmer-led, bottom-up festival, and I think something that groundswell teaches us is that often farmers are really ahead of the game, even when it comes to kind of scientific evidence and innovation, and that there's so much more potentially we can learn from farmers. And I think I think it's a shame, that the land use consultation happened in the middle of lambing, for example, for upland farmers. So really there was no time for us to be meaningfully involved or consulted in that process. And I have lots of reflections on Joel's comments, and I think being a livestock farmer who deeply loves animals, I live with that uncomfortableness every day, Joel, about death. And I see a real issue, as Tara has mentioned, with kind of industrialized slaughter and the lack of like small local abattoirs and the ability to sort of see to the end of its life an animal that you may have deeply cared for is something I feel deeply uncomfortable about always. And I think a lot of farmers do, but I don't know that that's ever really recognised. In terms of some of the very exciting solutions that Joel has mentioned here, and a world where we move away from this current form of animal slaughter and the localization of some of these innovations, I think is such a great idea. Council farms sound like a great thing. Devon County Farms is one of the larger set of county farms, local authority owned farms for Phil and Hannah, which would be, I guess, not even state, like district level in the US, Phil, owned farms. The entirety of Devon County Farms, an example, Joel, if they look to sell it, would run Devon County Council for like less than 3 days. Like, it's just seen as such a small, teeny, pathetic part of their portfolio, I think, as a council, that it's not something that receives a lot of attention or a lot of the investment that it potentially could have to enable some of this, local food system approach, when they've looked at things like local supply, the realities of delivering that, I taking the point about the dairy industry more broadly on board, but the fact that it would take so long to deliver any small amount of food, beans, peas, milk, whatever, to each of those schools, for example, in that local area. It's just economically not something that they see as viable. The other end of that scale is we've seen Dorset look in the local nature recovery strategies at taking their county farms back in hand just to rewild them for BNG. Which
biodiversity net gain for anyone who's
biodiversity net gain, which comes with its own suite of issues and caveats. And it seems like quite a bit of a short-term solution to a food system and a biodiversity issue, especially if it's, you know, no actual net gain, it really, in real terms, and the sacrifice of existing potentially ancient woodlands in many circumstances across the UK for some new trees that go fast. So these cracks of light certainly exist. I really agree. I think there are many lenses for looking at those cracks, and I think we need to be sure that the local community is involved in the decision-making processes about how we open those cracks up.
Thanks. Hannah, do you have any comments? I also have a question for you about metrics, actually. So, but say what you want to say first.
Yeah, I wanted to comment on this farmer issue because my research group has done quite a bit of research about how farmers could be involved in cellular agriculture. And so we have interviewed farmers in Finland and also political stakeholders in Finland and Germany. And then so basically, of course, there is also in cellular agriculture also the need for some feedstock, how the cells are fed, except these kind of technologies than solar foods where the CO2 is used as a carbon source. So that's completely land free, so no agriculture inputs needed. But many of these other cellular agriculture applications, they need glucose and cultivated meat, also amino acids. So we still need farmers to produce the inputs. But then also we have been asking the farmers what they think about could they actually produce some of these cell-cultivated foods at the farm, because many farmers, or at least some farmers, have some food processing, producing yogurt or cheese at the farm, or they have bioreactors for anaerobic digesters for producing biogas. So then why not to have bioreactors for producing cell-cultivated foods if the technology is made easy enough for them to operate. So we have been thinking about these kind of things. And then also, like, I see that it's not either or, so regenerative farming or cellular agriculture or alternative proteins. We can have both. So then, especially because if we need less agricultural land for food production, if we have less livestock, then we have more land to have maybe low yielding farming, agroecological regenerative farming practices, and then we can produce these cell cultivated foods as well.
And Hannah, so you said you did this work with farmers. What were their responses, or you're still waiting to?
Yeah, no, I have a PhD student who is now finishing his PhD thesis, and there are a couple of publications, and one will be published very soon about these farmer interviews, and it was actually quite interesting and surprising, because at least I assumed that the farmers would be very much against, but actually it was really surprising that many of the farmers, and especially older farmers, they were like that, oh well, yeah, we have seen these technologies coming all the time, new technologies for farming, so they saw that this cellular agriculture is just part of the evolution. So, and they were like, oh well, yeah, we could operate these kind of bioreactors. It's much easier than taking care of the livestock. So why not? That I wouldn't eat it, but if somebody would pay for me to produce, then yeah, why not? But then, yeah, of course, there were some farmers who really love working with the livestock or that they saw that the dairy farming was part of the family tradition, and they felt like that they want to continue this. But yeah, it was really interesting and surprising.
Yeah. Joel and Jen, and then I think I'm aware we need to move on to some questions. There's lots of questions in the chat. So yeah.
Yeah, just to follow on from that thing of, what could farmers do once all their jobs have been taken, to put it very simplistically. I mean, the first thing to say is, there's very much a picture here where you say, blooming hell, this looks pretty inevitable. This is going to disrupt the market in some way, given that it's entering and you can't hold it back globally. So it's going to be produced somewhere and we'll import it if we don't do it locally. You could be looking at for us, we've got a domestic example of this, which is the miners' kind of economic collapse, where a whole industry was walked off a cliff and basically whole communities collapsed as a result and still haven't recovered. I think that really is quite plausible that you could see something like that. A more positive image, that you could be looking at is kind of like trying to think about these big shifts. I pointed towards the shift of the use of horses. It was at the beginning of the last century, in 1900, we had like one horse for every 10 people in this country because we used them for absolutely everything, and we were appalling to them. Most of them were dead by the age of 3 because we drove them into the earth. Now it's about one horse for every sort of 80, 90 people in the UK. So, and what are they used for? Well, they're looked after better, certainly, and they're used for, you might say, higher value uses such as cultural pursuits and leisure. So it might be a world in which all of this crap food, 60% of the UK is eating ultra processed food anyway. Do we mind if that's produced in a factory? It's already crap food. Do we need to be using lots of land to produce that? Maybe not. But the good food, the prime cuts, that I'm sure the meat from Jen's farm is extraordinary, right? That might be that's the bit that meat eaters actually have at the center of the plate when they're not eating ultra processed food. Now, with that, just in terms of what happens to the farmers, just a possible picture here. The one thing that this revolution could lead to is more land and more labor, right? With more land, you can have lower yield systems, really low yield, getting close to agri-rewilding, where you've got large herbivores playing an ecological function in the landscape and achieving 2 aims there: small amount of food production, large amount of nature. But then you've got the other end, lots of labor. Let's be realistic. They're farmers. They're not going to retrain as lab technicians. That's silly. But they could do other kinds of farming potentially, right? And there you've got high labor agroecology, which can start to match the yields of industrial intensive agriculture, actually, because you've got that extra input of labor. It will need support from the government, but it could achieve these whole other beautiful aims of very high quality organic and regenerative plant-based products there. So 2 possibilities, but it needs policy. It needs someone at the helm, right?
I think that's the general tenor of the discussion, Jen, and then we're going to move on to questions.
Yeah, I broadly agree with everything Joel's been saying there. I think I put my hand up because I was interested that Hannah had mentioned that she was surprised that these farmers were so open to innovation. And I guess for me, working with farmers for the entirety of my academic career, as well as being born and bred on a farm and growing up around farming, I see farmers always as open to innovation, open to technologies. Some tractors nowadays are like spaceships. I would not know where to start, for better or worse, because some of them are certainly far too big and heavy and monster machines. But this evolution, I think, is as much a part of the farming identity as our heritage breeds and our connection to multi-generational connections to the landscape. I do really agree with Joel's point about this risk of the domestic example of the miners' economic collapse. So where I live in the North Pennines in Alston, I look out my window and see Nent Head, which is a tiny mining village straight over the Dale top from County Durham, which this entire area is as impacted by mining as it is by farming. And there's a continued economic deprivation in the little village nearest to us that has been here for 8 decades now, and there's a real issue there, and a real lack of trust that I think for these policymakers that Joel has mentioned need to be at the spearhead of this. Agriculture continues to feel let down by policymakers time and time again, and how they repair that and bring us round to this idea of moving into these exciting high yield potential alternate industries is going to depend on that trust being rebuilt, and we're a long way from that in the UK specifically at the moment. But yeah, agri rewilding kind of sounds like what I want my farm to be. If only the policy options were there for me. I've developed a very comprehensive countryside stewardship agreement that I desperately want to be in, but the policy window is not open for me to move towards peatland rewetting, riparian strips along, you know, all our streams, enhancing scrub. We have an incredible population of breeding waders, curlews, lapwings, black grouse, which are extremely rare. Even, you know, we've got 9 of the boys up on our fell. Oyster catchers, snipe, redshank, all these things. I'd love to reintroduce water voles. I can't do it without the policy support, you know, to bring these things in. And all this land use, this multifunctionality, alternative proteins is one part of that, but without these policy improvements and that trust being rebuilt, I'm concerned that will be the main stopper, personally.
Thank you. Yeah, that was, I think we all want to be invited to visit your farm, Jen, but anyway, so
anytime for everyone.
I'm going to move over to a couple of questions. I'm actually going to start with the second one because I'd like to hear a little bit more about the kind of how we measure impact and at what scale of resolution, and how different metrics give rise to different kinds of answers, which you hinted at a little bit, Hannah. You showed your kind of traditional LCA, and then in your last slide, you said, well, you need to look at life cycle assessment in the context of these other kind of frameworks for thinking about impact. So I have a question from Tamsin Blackster, who says, what distinction should we make among the different alternative protein technologies in terms of environmental benefits? Which are more convincing, which less so? And I'm going to add to that question to you, Hannah, by saying, and using which metrics?
Yeah, exactly. And something that I forgot to say is that there is also a huge variation in the environmental impacts of the same product, depending on how it is produced and yeah, what kind of cells are used. For example, for cultivated meat, what is the end product? Is it some kind of structured meat, like a steak style of meat, or only single cells that are used for some processed products? And what kind of bioreactors have been used, what kind of culture medium? Also for other than cell cultivated, or yeah, then for cell cultivated foods, there is also a lot of uncertainty because these products are still under development. So the studies are only based on estimates, modeling, a lot of assumption what the large-scale production facilities could look like, but then they are not operating in that scale yet. So for cultivated meat especially, we don't even know if the systems would work properly in that scale, what the studies have modeled, and what are the possibilities to improve the energy efficiency of the systems, and what kind of all culture medium or the nutrient feedstock ingredients could be used, so that all affect the environmental impact. So it's not possible to say that cultivated meat is always worse than algae or something like that, but it really depends on the product and how it's produced. But then, of course, like for land use, these gas fermented microbes that don't require any inputs from agriculture, so they have really low land use. So that's for sure. And then the question is really that how we will use the land if it will be released, because then of course that question as well, will it be released, or is it just that these alternative proteins are kind of covering the increased demand of protein, which is due to the population growth and the increased consumption of protein per person. So it could be that these alternative proteins are not going to be able to free land from agriculture, but they actually just reduce the need to cut more forests for agriculture. But then exactly that is what the life cycle assessment alone cannot do. So it cannot answer to these kind of questions that what will happen to what are the consequential impacts in that scale. So then what we really need is some sort of integrated modeling where we are looking at these wider consequences to land use and also the other commodities, the input production, what kind of changes there are. How can we also utilize side streams from food industry for the cell-cultivated food production or other alternative proteins as well. And all of these links between the energy use and the other commodities, that the non-food commodities that livestock produces, how we replace those, like I said earlier. So these kind of bigger questions, we need different methods than product level life cycle assessments.
Thank you. I mean, there's also a question which I'm going to sort of maybe direct to you, Phil. I mean, I think one of the, I'm just sort of picking up from the sorts of things you're saying is that there is obviously a moral hazard, in your view, in going down this direction, in that it distracts from the other perhaps more structural things that we might need to do. So there is a question about, you know, one of the questions is that telling people in rich countries that they already consume more protein that they need doesn't seem to be working. Consumers seem to have an enormous appetite for high protein dairy, for instance. What does work? And I'm also going to connect that question to one that is just below it, which somebody called Sarah Kunz asks, how do you think the development of cellular ag could collaborate with bigger social environmental movements like degrowth, post-growth, and agroecology? So I guess this is a question sort of about where you see the role of policy and a balance of effort in terms of what you're going to put your money, your resources, your policy attention into, and whether you can see a sort of a happy marriage between putting efforts with a different economic model.
Yeah, I don't hear anyone telling people in rich countries they already consume more protein than they need. All I hear in the firm's marketing materials is people want more protein. Here's how to get it from our firm. We know that the US government dietary guidelines are completely ignored. They don't have much impact. But we do see the massive impact of these firms' promotional materials, which, as I mentioned, is a tax deduction. So it's subsidized, and the bigger the firm, the larger the subsidy, because they can get lower rates for national markets instead of advertising in local markets. And milk consumption has actually been on the decline in the US. The industry promoted the idea 100 years ago that people should have a glass of milk with every meal. That was not common before that. And the pressure, subsided and people fell away. People have intolerance issues with milk. And so milk consumption was already declining when alternatives to milk started increasing. It would be an interesting question to see how much those alternatives like oat and coconut and almond actually displaced some dairy consumption. But what does work is dismantling the subsidies. There's no investment in promoting vegetable consumption other than a very tiny amount for public health agencies. So in terms of collaborating with bigger movements, the frustration I have is we have actually existing solutions to these challenges like agroecology, but the billionaires don't benefit from those. They're not investing in agroecology startups. Public funding for agroecology is a fraction of what the market is. So if we're going to build a movement, let's talk about the issue of the concentration of power. And instead of reinforcing that by subsidizing technologies that may or may not work, but are going to in effect be centralized by big firms, I don't think that's an effective way to build a coalition.
Right. Okay. That was depressing. Okay, so here's the top voted question, and I can see various ways of answering this. Are we really lacking any nutrients when replacing consumption of animal-based foods, particularly meat, through a balanced non-animal-based diet? If so, which ones do you think are most relevant to be supplemented? So I guess this follows on from your question, Phil. If you feel that the answers are more or less there, which is a combination of system shift, production shift, consumption shift, then what bits and pieces might need scooping up with a bit of supplementation, or do you not think that there's any need for that at all? But if there was, what would be top of your agenda? And I mean, this is a kind of nutrition question. We did explore that in the previous webinar, but I wondered if you had any thoughts.
Yeah, I'm not a nutritionist, but my understanding is if you're 100% vegan, you're going to need some B12 supplements, and that's pretty much it. But overall, with a system shift, we would have people eating a lot less meat and still getting adequate protein, adequate amounts of other nutrients. And, there are multiple ways to do that. I don't have all the answers. But it's going to have to be a systems perspective and not looking for techno fixes.
Does anyone have any other comments on that? Hannah?
Yeah, so I guess vitamin D is also quite low, or that's in the Nordic countries is anyway recommended to take vitamin D supplements in winter time in any diet. But then, of course, some others to pay attention is also calcium and iron, because iron is there, but is not so well bioavailable than from the livestock sources. So then many of these meat substitutes and dairy substitutes, plant-based substitutes, they are then fortified. So many of these nutrients are added to those products. So in that sense, like plant-based dairy alternatives are a good source of calcium and vitamin D, B12 as well. So then basically it is possible to construct a vegan diet using these kind of fortified foods, so that there is no need to take vitamin supplements. But then, of course, that's the case in the Western countries. But then the low-income countries that Phil mentioned, then that's not necessarily an option, or that those products are not available. But then, if you think about something like, I think Jennifer asked earlier about the nutritional content of cultivated meat, for example. So then I think zinc is there because it's part of the protein. But then iron is something that is more complicated, because there is no blood involved. So that's what at least some of the cultivated meat researchers are thinking about, how to get iron in it as well. But then, actually my research group have published a couple of papers where we looked at how to incorporate these novel foods, alternative proteins in meals and diets as well, so that the meals and diets are or including all the nutrients that are required. But yeah, we had to little bit like it was not possible to meet all the requirements. So I think, yeah, we had to take some of them, of course, the B12 like out that because that will need to be supplemented. But then it's not only about, I think exactly that we need to think about the whole diet, how to construct the whole diet in a new way, and not only thinking about that we need to get all the same nutrients from some replacing products. So that's also important. Like in vegan diet, there is need to eat more green vegetables for the calcium, and also whole wheat grains for iron, and nuts and seeds. So the whole diet needs to be taught in a different way and not just replacing something with something.
Yeah. I'm aware that like we're all people who work and live in the global north. There's a question here which says, can the panel address issues in emerging economies, low middle income countries, rather than the focus on Europe and high income countries? Because that's where industrial animal agriculture is expanding rapidly. But I guess it's also the part of the world where animal farming is, you know, to your point, Phil, it is about so much more than just the production of food and indeed a particular kind of nutrient. So I wonder, maybe this is one for you, Joel. I mean, you've been making the case for these alternative proteins in a country like the UK. Do you have any thoughts on its role, impact, risks, opportunities in other parts of the world?
Yeah, I mean, we've done a very small bit of preparatory work about because in our organization, we've got colleagues in Africa and in Southeast Asia as well. And it seems like the highest stakes, to excuse a meat-based pun there, are for people in the global south, of course, here. So you've got obvious things to gain from. So particularly with precision fermentation, the possibility of making abundant, cheap protein powders with very low environmental impacts, but potentially because we've got the efficiencies still to come. You know, remember that alternative proteins are maybe 20, 30 years into their efficiency life cycle, with 10,000 years to improve the cow. It's got about as good as it can get, whereas alternative proteins could get better and better and better as you keep innovating with it. So the potential there for protein powder or for supplemented local foods through precision fermentation is really huge, as is the possibility for essentially kind of climate, not only climate resilient, but climate independent agriculture in places with food security that's going to increase with climate instability. That's seriously appealing to some countries. But it's really genuinely hard from having done some work in Uganda recently. It's honestly totally implausible to think there's going to be a major domestic industry in many of the countries that stand to benefit from that climate resilience piece themselves. So what they're looking at here is becoming further indebted to a global food system that really is dominated by global north players. So, and this is with this whole thing, I've never really campaigned on anything that seems to have so many enormous potential benefits and risks at the same time. I'm just throwing obviously a very wealthy global south country that's just an interesting one here, which is that Singapore is obviously racing ahead with this. For them, it's all about food security because they're so reliant on imports, being a country that doesn't exactly have agriculture. But it's notable that I think we're going to see more and more sort of strategic investments in the countries that can do it, because it's actually a bit of a no-brainer when it comes to that kind of food security.
Yeah, I mean, also the extent to which it sort of affirms that, I mean, you were talking about like protein powders and the huge, and of course there is a long track history of here's my new techno food that is going to solve all the problems. And I guess there's a lot of, one has to be very, very wary of that approach.
Terrifying.
Yeah.
Potentially. Yeah. And I mean, I think what we're trying to investigate is it at all plausible to find some innovation hubs to at least start making some inroads there to see a domestic industry in this start to take off. is not out of the question in some global south countries, but you have an inverse relationship, right, between the countries that are most food insecure and most need the help, have the least infrastructure, university development to be able to benefit from the revolution. So I think it's pretty much weighted towards deepening the issues we've got with the global food system already, right? Unfortunately.
Yeah. Okay, I've got one question from somebody called Andy Adler, who says, from a sustainability aspect, this conversation is very focused on carbon. I think we have actually moved a bit beyond that, but we'll take that line of argument. Once food is grown in a more regenerative fashion, some of the challenges of food around planetary boundaries may disappear. How will the panel then create the diversity needed on farm to make regenerative farming work if AP has been a success? So I'm not quite sure whether this question is saying, will AP make you go so far down the road that regen ag won't be an option? Or is it a question around how can those two things work together? Maybe answer it as you wish.
I'll throw in here, just jump straight back in if that's all right, because Tara brought me along to a room full of regenerative agriculture advocates as the dissenting voice last year, which was great fun. That I'm skeptical of the term regenerative agriculture because it's so ill-defined. I'm not skeptical of the motives of most people behind it. I think they're very honourable, and that doesn't mean that there aren't examples of it that go very well. But there's the reasonable question is regenerative of what? If it's regenerative in an ecosystem, which used to be there, then it's not farming anymore. If it's regenerative in a closed input sense, that is interesting, because then you've got a completely closed loop and no sort of ghost acres elsewhere subsidizing your farming, and that really is interesting. But to think more about agroecology, which for me has more of a kind of political critique attached to it, which seems very exciting and more of a sense of it radicalness for that. Just to re-emphasize, I think it really is an important point. Farming is pretty much a nationalized industry in the UK and in many other places by virtue of its subsidies, right? It's like it couldn't exist in its current format without taxpayer stuff. And so I think it's okay for taxpayers with farmers to say, right, well, we should have a bit of a steer and a say about what this industry looks like as it develops. And so that's the place where I think you could say, yeah, there are types of agroecological farming that we really, really like, and well, we're going to put more money into it. As Jen said, though, the horrific thing is all the subsidies are just, we've just about recouped back to the level that we had under the last government and not had the cuts that we thought we might. But we should be looking at 10 timesing it. This should be a major national priority, this sort of subsidization. And it just doesn't cost that much money for the kind of results you get.
Jen, you want to say, come in?
Yeah, sure. I mean, yeah, Joel said a lot of what I think I would say on this point, but just to give that funding some context, I think the agriculture budget in the UK currently is something like what the NHS spends on stationery, and it's really important that the NHS has stationery, but that just gives you a kind of an idea of the scale that we're talking about in terms of funding. One of the key issues that we have here in the UK is an insistence by the current and previous governments on green box WTO agri-environment schemes. So I guess I would contest the idea, Joel, that we are under a subsidies system currently. Subsidies, the basic payment scheme, a subsidy. An agri-environment scheme, which is determined as public money for public goods, is based on an income for gone plus costs model. There is no, in theory, no additional support. And I can tell you that the funding under higher level stewardship is we've not provided any income support. So we've moved from a system, in theory, a system of subsidies to a system of agri-environment schemes which are based on this income for gone plus cost, which doesn't actually acknowledge any value in the biodiversity benefits. So to come to the question by the member of the audience about the conversation being focused on carbon, it's very hard to put enough value on biodiversity to sort of incentivize real meaningful change and real delivery of biodiversity, even in a system where we could move to the successful implementation of AP and the reduction of sort of carbon, the issues that are created by carbon for agriculture, when the benefits of biodiversity are so poorly recognised and so poorly compensated at the moment in our sort of governance systems. And how we do that is, I'm not sure, when there is this insistence on green box. There's no reason we couldn't have amber box agri-environment schemes, which, you know, give some value to the curlew chick, or the, you know, wooded pasture, or the wonderful nectar plots. I mean, to some extent you could say that they've been sort of a victim of their own success in SFI, where we've seen huge amounts of money be spent on large arable farms being turned to winter bird feed for 3 years, and once they stop getting paid, they'll go back to probably very conventional arable ground at the end of their 3-year SFI agreement, if there's not hundreds of thousands of pounds keeping that up. So the system is imperfect. I'm not sure how we create the diversity needed on farm without a little more give in the system we have currently, and as Joel says, a lot more budget.
Okay, I'm aware we've got very little time left. Hannah, you want to say something? Can I ask that you make your final point, and then you conclude with your 20 seconds of any final thing you want to say? And I would be particularly interested to understand where you feel the points of core disagreement have been, but also where you feel that there has been some commonality in your and sometimes very complementary views, but with some tension. So just like your final 20 seconds of responses, and your question that you're going to make, your comment, Hannah.
Yeah, I wanted to comment first on the biodiversity and answer to this question. So yeah, biodiversity, actually we are now working on a paper in my research group where we look at the biodiversity impacts of cellular agriculture in global scale. And then the other environmental impacts, so actually many of the papers, so in my presentation I showed this kind of summary table that had only land use, energy use, and climate impact, but actually the papers that these bars are, or the results are based on, the actual papers for the single products, we have lots of different environmental impact categories like eutrophication, acidification, and so on. So in life cycle assessment, we can have 16 different environmental impact categories. So we are considering also other impacts. And yeah, so then
your final 10 seconds, because
the final comment.
We've got a minute left before I have to finish.
Yeah, okay, so
10 seconds.
Yeah, so the final, so yeah, I think it's going to be a mixture of different, so these alternative proteins or cellular agriculture especially alone is not going to solve the issues, but we need lots of different things, and in different, also considering the locations, so in different places, different solutions.
Who else has got something to add to that? Any other final comments from?
Well, I'll quickly say that I think the biggest point of difference between Phil and I've learned a huge amount from Phil. I'm really excited to go away and think about, and from Jen as well on counterpoints. I think Hannah and I are more naturally aligned already. And I guess that what still seems to me, though, is I think there is a possibility of holding two things at the same time: a full throttle rethink of global food systems based on equity, whilst also massive investments, ideally public investments, in alternative proteins at the same time. I think they're worth doing both. Yeah.
Thank you. Phil, Jen, any final comments there?
Sure. I'm not opposed to private investment. The animal welfare argument is quite strong. If those technical hurdles can be overcome with private investment, that would be interesting to see. But I don't see a case for public subsidies.
And Jen, last word to you.
Yeah, I guess this is where maybe Phil and I disagree. I think public funding is going to be the way forward, and I think regulation is super important. I'd like to see that massive investment that Joel's mentioned in public proteins, but also in land use transformation and in helping farmers do the very best they can for nature and for food. Yeah, haven't seen a compelling case for sort of BNG and that kind of private investment yet in the UK, really, that doesn't turn into a form of green lairdism. So I feel like there's an exciting everything everywhere all at once approach, hopefully, to come.
Yeah, and if you haven't seen the movie, go and watch it. It's a very good movie. So with this, I'm going to say thank you very much to all the panelists for a really great conversation. This is the last in our webinar series. Josh is writing up, and we will be producing a table discussion paper, which will try to draw together the strands of the discussion of the whole webinar series, and also point to potential areas of future work and collaboration. If anyone wants to have a chat with us about the direction that this could take, I would be very keen. So please get in touch. So I think that's it from me for now. There will be a recording. Please, there's a feedback form. It really helps us with the kind of monitoring, evaluation and all the rest of it. So please fill it in if you have a moment to spare. And I think that's it from me for now. So thank you very much, everybody, and good evening.
Thanks for organising, Tara.
Thank you. Okay.
Thanks a
Bye.
lot. Bye.
Bye. Bye.